Thank you, Sue, and Ken, congratulations on an absolutely wonderful function and something that's so crucial for Georgia Tech and our future. It's a great honor to be here today because, as we know, we're honoring two great citizens of Georgia and two people connected to Georgia Tech. The legacy of Mayor Ivan Allen provides a strong and rich setting for the recognition of President Jimmy Carter. Both are alumni of this institution, and we're very proud that this university provided a testing ground for the development of their leadership. In turn, both of them have been absolutely crucial to the building of a society that has enabled an institution such as Georgia Tech to grow and thrive. My own sense of kinship with Jimmy Carter is based in our common roots. We both were born in rural South Georgia, and we tell similar stories about coming to the big city of Atlanta to study at Georgia Tech. President Carter also began his political career in rural Georgia by winning election to the Sumter County School Board. He then served in the state Senate and was governor of Georgia before being elected President of the United States in 1976. His accomplishments as president were so significant that they still form a frame of reference for the daily news of today. Reporters covering the Middle East hark back to the Camp David Accords and the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, which Jimmy Carter negotiated, the Panama Canal Treaty, the SALT II Treaty with the Soviet Union, and the establishment of diplomatic relations with China were also significant achievements of his administration. However, when history looks back at Jimmy Carter's life, I suspect he'll be remembered as much for his accomplishments after he left the White House. Rather than retire to a life of playing golf and collecting huge speaking fees, he's continued a career of service and diplomacy that has won him tremendous admiration and respect all over the world. Instead of a static repository of documents, his version of the Presidential Library is the Carter Center, which has been waging peace, fighting disease, promoting democracy, and building hope around the world for 20 years. And Jimmy Carter himself continues to put his words to work by pounding nails as a frequent volunteer for Habitat for Humanity. He has written 16 books since leaving office, beginning with his memoirs as president and covering topics as diverse as public policy, aging, his religious faith, poetry, and even a children's book illustrated by his daughter, Amy. He continues to speak out on the issues of our time with wisdom and a firmly set moral compass, and his words call us to think at times and think hard about this world and our responsibility to help make it a better place. We're looking forward to hearing from him on that score in just a few minutes. President Carter's leadership has been important for us all, and it's an honor to have him with us today and to recognize him for his lifetime of service and achievement by awarding him the 2002 Ivan Allen Jr. Prize for Progress and Service. At this time, I would like to invite President Carter to the podium with Dean Rosser.
President Carter, on behalf of Ivan Allen College and Georgia Tech, I would like to present you the Ivan Allen Jr. Prize for Progress and Service at Ivan Allen College, Georgia Institute of Technology, March 22nd, 2002. Thank you so much.
Well, Wayne, I appreciated that nice introduction. As Tom would probably guess, I want to make it clear that my books are still on sale. Several of the books, including my book of poetry, is mostly about my young life. I grew up in the Deep South, in the deep southwest of Georgia. where my formative years were shaped to a great degree by 100 years of racial prejudice, racial segregation that followed much longer than that of slavery. And it's hard for anyone outside of the South to understand the depth of feeling that existed then, the prejudices that swept our schools, our churches, our courts, including the federal courts, all the way to the Supreme Court, that justified this discrimination. There were a very few courageous people that broke that shell that we had built around ourselves. One of them was Ivan Allen, Jr. We've just seen what he did to Atlanta. That's well known. He was a great mayor, perhaps as great as any mayor who ever served in this country. But it's also interesting to remember that in Douglas, Georgia, and in Plains, Georgia, the name Ivan Allen was a beacon light for breaking through the darkness. And I'm personally grateful to him. I would probably never have been president had it not been for Ivan Allen, Martin Luther King Jr., and just a few other people like him. More in my generation, I'm not all that much younger, but his son, Ivan Allen III, was special to me. I think all of us in the room probably have a very few friends. Maybe you could name them on less than one hand. And Ivan Allen III was one of those friends for me. This morning I left my office at the Carter Center. There are two photographs right where I sit. One is Amy's son, my 11th grandchild, already well above average. And the other one was Ivan Allen III, whom I still love. Well, I'm glad to come to Georgia Tech today. I come for two reasons. One, I've already expressed my admiration for Ivan Allen and his name and his family, but also because my cousin, Hugh Carter, is on the Board of Regents, the only one who really represents Georgia Tech. And when Hugh tells me to come and speak, I do come, although I'm not on the lecture circuit, as someone has already pointed out. I come to Georgia Tech because I love this institution. I've been to 4 universities in my career, ultimately studying nuclear physics. But I think like all other Tech alumni, no matter how long you spent here, there's something special about this place. And when I put in my own mind or heart the list of my attachments and my sentiments, Georgia Tech has always been at the top. I lived in Knowles Dormitory. I understand the only dormitory that's been torn down since then. And my roommate was Robert Ormsby. And we didn't get along at all. We were competitive, and I thought he was very arrogant and didn't know enough about life. I'm sure he thought about the same with me. Later, I was elected governor, and Lockheed built the C-5A, and I was invited to go out and take an early ride on the C-5A, which was very exciting to me. When I got to Lockheed, I was amazed to see Robert Ormsby as the president of Lockheed. And I said, "You don't imagine how surprised I am to see you got this far." And he said, "How do you think I felt when you were elected governor?" So we have had a good relationship about that. When I was finally elected president, I was invited back to Georgia Tech to make a speech. And I was given an honorary degree, PhD. I was the first one. Because at that time, the Board of Regents had a law that you could not receive an honorary degree from a university in Georgia unless you were an alumnus of that institution, subsequently elected President of the United States. So at That's true. So at that time, I was the only one in the world qualified. Well, so you can see that my ties to Georgia Tech and to the Ivan Allen family are deep, and I especially appreciate this award because of that. I've been assigned a subject, Open Society in an Age of Terrorism, following civil liberties in a time of terrorism, in an age of terrorism, and I wouldn't have chosen this subject for myself. And what I prepared before coming here, it will probably overlap because I don't see any way to separate completely civil liberties on the one hand and an open society. And maybe the people who drafted the titles had something in mind with which I'm not familiar. But I think it's good for us to be cautious about using the word terrorism or terrorist, because there is a natural inclination for us to brand as terrorists people with whom we disagree. I want to hasten to say I'm not excusing people who take innocent lives, as was the case on 9/11. But I went to Camp David with Prime Minister Begin and President Sadat in 1978, and we negotiated very successfully a peace agreement that has never had one word violated. But Prime Minister Begin was incapable of referring to any terrorist, regardless, any Palestinian, regardless of age, except as a terrorist. Later, people referred to Martin Luther King Jr. as a communist, a terrorist, whatever epithet they thought was most destructive of his reputation. A few weeks ago, the Carter Center had a group of observers in Zimbabwe, along with other international observers, to try to see if Mugabe was going to have an honest election. And he branded all international observers there as terrorists and demanded that we leave, which we did. So you see, it's not easy for human beings to refrain from the total condemnation of those with whom we disagree or whom we fear or whom we cannot understand. So we ought to be cautious in this country in separating ourselves as holy or specially endowed by God with some privileged position to the detriment of others who might worship or live or believe differently from us. There is another phrase that's used called fundamentalism, which is hard to define. I happen to be a Baptist. They are moderate Baptists, they are conservative Baptists, they are liberal Baptists, they are fundamentalist Baptists. And we distinguish between one another, even though we worship the same Savior and attend the same churches, sometimes to the detriment of one another by using those kinds of things to describe those who differ. Sometimes we attach ourselves to God, whether we are Muslims or Protestants or Catholics or Jews or Buddhists or Hindus. And we tend to feel, first of all, first stage, that people who are different from us are wrong. And maybe all of us are guilty of that. The next step is to think that those that are different from us are inferior. And the next step is to think that those that are different to us are even subhuman. And that their lives are not valuable in the eyes of God. So there's a tendency for us to derogate or to condemn or to ignore those who are different from us. I have been president, and I knew a lot when I went. I think I learned a lot when I was there. But I've learned a great deal more since I left the White House. My work now in the Carter Center is really concentrated in the poorest and most destitute and forgotten and ignored societies on earth. We have programs in 65 nations in the world. 35 of those, not accidentally, are in Africa. And I've gotten to know people who have been condemned by our own government. Not much more than a week ago, I was in Khartoum, in Sudan, that has a fundamentalist Muslim government. I really feel uneasy when President Bush, who's made some wonderful statements the last few days, brands an entire nation or entire people as evil, because it tends to convince people who listen to him as our commander-in-chief with great respect and admiration, which he certainly deserves, to feel that somehow a person who is living in North Korea or in Iran or even Iraq is evil. I'm one of the few Americans who's ever been to North Korea. I went there with my wife in 1994 because we were threatened with a war in the peninsula. And no one would speak to the leader of North Korea, Kim Il-sung, whom I despised, because I was a submarine officer during the Korean War, and I saw many of my own fellow naval officers and men killed because of the Korean War, for which I held him completely culpable. But he called on me to come because he wanted to communicate with my country, and I did finally go. And my wife and I went to Seoul, and we crossed the DMZ, and we went to Pyongyang, and we negotiated completely successfully with him, and then came back to South Korea. We were the first people of any country that made that trip in 43 years. But I saw there that the North Koreans are not evil people. They are paranoid. They are isolated. They are fearful. They don't understand us. And they listen with incredible attention to every word that's said by any leader in America. So we need to be careful, I think, as responsible Americans about how we use language, sometimes maybe for political reasons or to make a point vividly so people will remember it, and how it affects others as well. I've been concerned. I'm not a lawyer. In fact, if I had been a lawyer, I never would have been elected governor or maybe president. But I have had a chance to participate in the making of laws and the drafting of laws and the approval or veto of laws and the implementation of laws. And I've been really concerned since the terrorist attack on our country at the danger to our legal system. There have been hundreds, maybe more than thousands, of people in our country who happen to be from Arab countries who have been detained, and some are still detained. And I saw in 60 Minutes a week or so ago that there are some who have never been able to visit their families or to get responsible lawyers. I read the newspaper this morning. The Secretary of Defense says that those in Guantanamo, even if acquitted of their charges, cannot depend on being released. They'll continue to be held. I've read other reports I think are true, that when we have a tough suspected terrorist arrested, we have transferred them to other nations where torture is permitted. We don't permit torture in our own country, but we kind of look the other way to get confession. Well, this bothers me very much, and I feel sure that many people in this audience will not agree with my concern. I don't make many speeches anymore. But at the beginning of this millennium, I was asked to make a couple of important speeches, one in Asia and one in Scandinavia. And I was asked to choose a subject, what is the greatest challenge that the world faces in this new millennium? And I would tell you that the greatest challenge that we face in this room is a growing chasm between the rich and the poor. And I say growing deliberately because the difference between us is increasing, you might say, every day. If you go back to the beginning of the last century, if you compared the richest countries in the world, the richest 10 with the poorest 10, the ratio was 9 to 1. When you got to 1960, the ratio was 30 to 1. Now the ratio is about 75 to 1. Just to put it into perspective, the average American family has an income of $50,000. 1 out of 5 people on earth, including almost all those I visited in Africa a week or so ago, have an income of less than $1 per day. Just imagine for a moment, if it's possible, $1 per day for food, clothing, shelter, with almost a total absence of even hope for things like education or health care. And that's the way people live. Over half the people on earth live on less than $2 a day. I don't know if you care. I'm sure theoretically you would care because you don't want to see people living in poverty. But do you care enough to feel responsible? That's a question that Americans have had to face, and we haven't faced it well. I have to admit that when I was president, we had a very good foreign aid program, but I was assisted in my efforts in that respect because we were in the Cold War. And we didn't give money to Mali or Burkina Faso or Niger just for beneficent reasons. We didn't want the Soviets to come in there and give them a little bit more money so they'd be aligned with the Russians instead of us. So I had an advantage. But since then, our development assistance or humanitarian assistance, or as Americans would describe it almost as an epithet, foreign aid, has dropped precipitously. There are 22 nations on earth identified as industrialized countries. We're at the very bottom, far below the second nearest to the bottom. When a poll is run in America, how much do you think our country gives in foreign aid? The average answer, amazingly, was 15%. And when you ask them, how much do you think we ought to give? 5%. You know how much we give? 1/10 of 1% of our gross national product. Every other country gives more. The average European country gives 3.5 times more. Japan gives 4 times as much. Denmark gives 10 times as much. Norway gives 7 times as much, as do the Netherlands and Sweden and others. The American people are not stingy or greedy, and I don't think we are insensitive to the needs of other people. But in a time of so-called, I'll let use your 3 words, age of terrorism, with which I don't quite agree. What is an open society? Is it a rich society encapsulated in self-congratulations and intense commitments to security and the exclusion of others, or the reluctance to be responsible for the life of others? I think that's counterproductive. I think we could easily give 1/10 instead of 1,000th, maybe at least a 100th of our GNP for the alleviation of suffering, for health care, education, housing, food. I think we could. I made a trip recently in Africa just to recapitulate. I mentioned this trip last night to a group of business graduates from Harvard, honoring Art Blank, and I went to honor him. My wife and I started off in Egypt, and we went then to Sudan. Sudan is a country that's larger than all the states combined east of the Mississippi, that's been on a 19-year war. Over 2 million people have died. In civil wars now, for every soldier killed, there are 9 civilians who perish. The Carter Center has health programs in Sudan, eradicating guinea worm, dealing with rubber blindness, trachoma. We can't get to 2,500 villages in the south because of the war. We've taken on a project of eradicating guinea worm from the face of the earth. We've reduced the incidence from 3.5 million down to 65,000, which I'm sure all the tech graduates can instantly say is 98.5% reduction. But 80% of the remaining cases are in southern Sudan. And we can't get there because of the war, and the war's been going on 19 years. You don't ever read about the Sudan war in the newspapers. If somebody's killed in the West Bank or Gaza, it's headlines, New York Times. If 2,000 people are killed in southern Sudan, who cares? Well, we went from there down to South Africa, and there I met Bill Gates, who's actually junior, but they call him senior because the rich Bill Gates is the third. I'll call him Bill Gates Senior. He's in charge of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, a rich American and his wife who have been more generous perhaps than anyone in the history of the world. They've set aside $24 billion of their money to help poor people around the world. They've adopted tropical or infectious diseases as just one of their commitments. What they give every year for this one cause is more than the total budget of the World Health Organization. So you can see why we were willing to go and meet with them and go on a trip. The purpose of this trip was to look at the question of AIDS, HIV and AIDS in Africa. I've read about it in the paper. I've seen covers of Time and Newsweek magazine about it. I've seen the statistics. But we went personally just to see what is there that Americans, like all of us in this room, should know. 1,800 people every day in South Africa alone contracts AIDS. Just to put Africa in perspective, we all grieve over 3,100 people who had died in a terrorist attack. It was a horrible thing that shocked our country and the world. In Africa, that many people, 3,100 people, die with AIDS every 12 hours, every day. Last year, there'll be more this year. He and I and Nelson Mandela went to a clinic. Sitting in front of us were mothers who had volunteered to be tested. They all had AIDS. They were pregnant. And there's a treatment that you can give, nevirapine. It's given free. It costs about $4 to give it. And if you give that to a mother before the baby is born, the baby has a 50% chance not to have AIDS when it's born. Out of 2,000 clinics in South Africa, their ill-advised president will only permit this to be done in 15 clinics. But one governor that we visited there was courageous enough to violate his government's policies and to permit this mother-to-child prevention of AIDS. Bill Gates Sr. and Nelson Mandela and I picked up the babies. And we held them on our laps during the little brief ceremony while their mother sat in front. And I looked down at the baby, the little black baby, and I thought about Amy's baby. And I realized this child had 50% chance not all ready to have AIDS. They don't have many $4 is to invest in the life of a child. We went from there to argue with the president and Becky, who believes that there's no relationship between HIV and AIDS and that antiretroviral treatments are toxic. We lost the argument. But then we went to Nigeria, where they're doing a good job, and then to the Central African Republic, which I think is more descriptive of Africa. We only had time for a brief stop. We went to the only AIDS clinic in the entire country. And there were 267 patients there that day. Most of them were mothers with children of different ages. They were standing in a line welcoming us there, hoping we could do something. We didn't. They don't have any treatment. They don't have any prevention program. All they could do to go to the clinic was to get a morsel of food to keep them alive one more day. These were ambulatory patients, and they stay there at the clinic or come back every day as long as they can still stand erect. And then they are transferred to the hospital to die in a bed. 90% of all the beds in Bangui, which is the capital, are filled with AIDS patients. Well, I really didn't intend to talk to you about this, but I think it's important to know that when you talk about age of terrorism and open society, that most of the world is not obsessed with terrorism. To be blunt about it. We are. We're probably the safest people in the world. What is our obsession for the last 6 months? Terrorism. And I despise terrorism. Terrorists took American hostages when I was president. It may possibly have cost me re-election. I don't know. But the point is that there should be other things that obsess Americans. And I would say the obsession should be just as much with that little tiny baby that I or Nelson Mandela or Bill Gates was holding in our lap as it was to some people on Guantanamo whose basic liberties, in my opinion, have been abridged. It's very important for us to have an open society, whether it's an age of terrorism or an age of enlightenment or an age of despair or an age of pandemics or age of war. No matter what that comes along, there's an inherent human need or obligation to understand what goes on in the rest of the world society, and not just at Georgia Tech or Emory University or Atlanta or the United States. I think this is a good opportunity for us to talk about things like that. And we don't want to give up what America has. I would like to see this country, but the first time perhaps in the history of the world where one nation has been the undisputed superpower. Even in Roman times, they didn't conquer China and so forth. We are the dominating factor in the world right now. And I would like to see us adopt as a nation the characteristics that almost all of you would define as the principles of America. I would like to see the people in Sudan, when they have a civil war, naturally say, let's go to Washington. They will help us find peace. Or if a country is struggling to have freedom and democracy for the first time, they would naturally say, I'm sure the White House will take care of our problem. And then we'll invest maybe a few tens of millions of dollars in our right to choose our own leaders. And maybe we would be the champions of human rights. Not just the right of protection from torture, but the right to have food and freedom and maybe health care and even education if you want to stretch your point. And be generous with the alleviation of suffering and poverty that's almost indescribable. To me, that's the definition of a superpower. And where is the responsibility for demanding that? I think among people like those assembled here. Ivan Allen did it back in the mid to late 60s. He transformed our Southern society, he and a few others, to get back to where America ought to be and where we had not been for 100 years. Where are the voices now to say, where should America be as we expand, you know, our influence and our opportunities? I think the Open Society should stretch our consciousness and our mind and our heart to reach the people who are destitute. I can't say that poverty-stricken people are more inclined toward violence than others. They're mostly peaceful people, just want to take care of their children and have a place to live. But with poverty comes despair and hopelessness and maybe anger at some undefinable or outside force that has caused them to be deprived. And that's a natural breeding ground for shrewd terrorists who might get them to support violent acts. None of the people who attacked the World Trade Center were poor, but they capitalized on poverty in Afghanistan to give them a base from which to attack our country. So how do you combat terrorism? Maybe one way is to give people hope.
President Carter, thank you for your remarks. You have really inspired us all very much. You've raised the questions that have been missing in our society and perhaps we're missing today from our discussions, and we appreciate that and thank you for that. You have been very generous in agreeing to answer questions. What we would like to do in order to make this happen is that two of our faculty from the Ivan Allen College, Professor Usha Nair-Reichert and Molly Cochran, will take care of presenting the questions to you. If you have a question, please write it on the cards that you have and pass them forward, and then they will present the questions to you. Yes, absolutely.
With some trepidation, I'm ready to go.
President Carter, the very first question has been prepared by the Ivan Allen College Student Advisory Board. Being one of a few select living presidents, you have a unique perspective that most of us will never fully understand. What types of political and personal forces does a president face in a situation such as dealing with terrorism post-September 11th that most of the public may not realize?
Well, that's not an easy question to answer because there would be a different response probably from each individual president who has served. And I'll just give you an example of what I had to face. As you may or may not remember, I'm sure you do if you're that old, in 1979 in November, American hostages were taken by some radical students who were called terrorists then. And they kept a few more than 54 of our hostages for a long time. And I was faced with the responsibility of what am I going to do about it. Most of my advisors said attack Iran because they were, in effect, insulting our country. My cousin Hugh Carter was there then. And that was a choice I had to make. I think had I launched a military attack on Iran, I would have been an instant hero. If I had sent American troops into battle, I would have been the commander-in-chief instead of a administrator of American government, bureaucracy. And I could have destroyed Iran in a couple of days. All their seaports could have been closed. All their oil fields could have been put out of commission. But I had to make a very difficult decision. I'm still not sure it's the right political decision, to be patient and to begin to deal with the leaders in Iran who would not communicate with me under any circumstances, even through Muhammad Ali or prominent people from around the world. So I decided to be patient and to deal with them in a different fashion. I confiscated their money, $12 billion, which in those days was a lot of money, and held that. Well, we kept, and we imposed an economic embargo on them and got every nation, I think, in the world to support our position. And I prayed for two things. One was that I would never say anything or do anything that would bring discredit to my country. And my second prayer, many times every day, was that every hostage would come home free and safe. And then the last 3 days I was president, I didn't ever go to bed. I stayed in the Oval Office negotiating. And on the morning of my going out of office, when President Reagan was taking the oath, that morning at 10 o'clock, all the hostages were released and put on an airplane at the end of the runway in Tehran. I thought they were going to take off, but they didn't. And as soon as President Reagan took the oath of office, the plane took off. The Ayatollah Khomeini didn't want him to leave while I was president. That was not a time of despair or disappointment for me. It was a most euphoric and glorious few moments of my life when I knew that every hostage was free. Well, that was a choice I had to make in dealing with one so-called terrorist attack, which brought our country great discredit, and I could have wiped them out. All the hostages would have died, but I could have killed 10,000 Iranians as well. How do you deal with it? I think that President Bush, quickly I should say, I think that his response in launching the military attack on Afghanistan was correct. And my hope now is that we will not get impatient, which some Americans are inclined to do, some administrations are inclined to do. When I was president also, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, and we launched a massive aid program, military, for the so-called freedom fighters in Afghanistan. And eventually they prevailed, and the Soviets withdrew. We were looked upon by the Afghan people as their saviors, because I and President Reagan and others had gone to their support. But we abandoned Afghanistan, and other countries did as well. And they didn't blame other countries, they blamed us, because we were looked upon as their saviors, and all of a sudden their only savior turned our attention other places. So that was a breeding ground, not only for poverty, because our country had been destroyed by the Soviet invasion, but it also left a nation filled with despair and hatred and resentment. You can't blame the Afghan people. I'm not trying to blame our own leaders, but it sends a signal. And how do you deal with terrorism? I think the best way to deal with terrorism is the same way you deal with AIDS, and that is to prevent it and to try to understand psychologically as a human being what is it in another human being that makes them receptive to terrorist temptations. If you take AIDS, on the other hand, if you can spend $2,000 on a person that's got AIDS, and you don't have as much success as if you spend $1 on a prostitute in Johannesburg to teach her what causes AIDS and to get her to use a condom in her sex acts. Bill Gates and I met with a representative group of a place that had 5,000 prostitutes. And they were educating those prostitutes. They call them commercial sex workers. require your customers to use condoms. And they were doing it. And they wouldn't have sex with anybody that didn't use a condom. And they had to have 10 or 15 tricks a day to pay their rent and to pay for their children at home and to pay bribes to the police. And they told us how difficult it was. But the point I'm making is that you can prevent AIDS by taking precautionary measures and understanding the idiosyncrasies of people just like us. And you can go a long way toward addressing terrorism by letting people in the world know that America is not only a nation of generosity and freedom and justice and equality, but that we really live that way. I think that's the best way to address terrorism. I'll make my other answers shorter.
President, President Carter, I have another question from one of our fine Georgia Tech students. What have you discovered is the most effective way to relate to those who oppose your beliefs, causes, and programs?
Well, what we do now, as I said earlier, in my whole life's work, I take off 1 week a year to build a Habitat house, but the other 51 weeks is at the Carter Center. And we really go into countries that are isolated. We have one basic principle that I'll mention to you. We've got some others that take too much time, and that is that we don't duplicate what anyone else does. If the World Bank or the IMF or Harvard University or Georgia Tech or the U.S. government is adequately meeting a need, we don't compete and we don't duplicate. We fill vacuums in the world, so that puts us in places where nobody else wants to go, and like Central African Republic and Chad and Haiti and places like that. But what we have found in order to change the consciousness of people about America is to use a phrase that I used in my inaugural address. I'm the only president ever elected who quoted his school teacher in an inaugural address. And my school teacher, as you know, was Miss Julia Coleman. And Miss Julia used to hammer on us as little kids. First of all, you boys might be president, but the other thing she would say was, we should accommodate changing times, but cling to unchanging principles. And that's a truism that we need to remember, because changing times is like now, where this audience has been obsessed with the fact that we live in an age of terrorism. I'm not criticizing anyone, because I've been part of that too. But the other part is cling to unchanging principles. What are the principles of life? And so we try to exhibit, as we go around to people in the third world particularly, where America is not understood and not appreciated and quite often despised because we're so rich and so insensitive, we try to let them know this is what America is. And so it makes a lot of difference. So we have done a few things. I tell you, we had guinea worm in 23,000 villages. We have been to every village and taught them what caused it and eradicated it in almost all cases. Last year, we personally went and gave free medicine given to us by Merck & Company to 7 million people who have river blindness. And we have 600,000 small farmers in our program in 12 different African countries. And they only have an average of 2 acres each, 1 hectare. And we teach them how to increase their food production, not tobacco, not cotton, but just food products. So I think to do something practical in improving the lives of others who might have had an adverse opinion of you, to answer your specific question, is something that all of us should remember. And I think that would be the case even if it's next door. As you would probably remember, a few years ago, 5 years before the Olympics, we started the Atlanta Project. And I inadvertently plotted on a map and announced to the public, we're going to help all the people that live in this red area. And it turned out to be 500,000 people. So we eventually divided them up into 25,000 groups each, 20 of them. And we've eventually got Georgia Tech and others to help us. But every 25,000 people were assigned a corporation. Marriott had one, Delta, Coca-Cola, the banks and so forth. And then later a university had one. So every 25,000 very poor people had a corporation and a university to help them. And I think that broke down the barriers between us. So I would say to answer your question, break down the barriers between people, and you find that it's not ever a sacrifice. It's opens up a blessing.
One last question, President Carter. In the light of the recent events, how has your view of the balance between freedom and security been affected?
I don't think the balance between freedom and security has been affected in any sort of permanent fashion. Obviously, in the aftermath of the attack on 9/11, our country had to become aware of security measures. And we had to become aware of steps that are sometimes uncomfortable at an airport that will prevent a recurrence of that kind of freedom of movement and freedom of training and flying an airplane that did permit the horrible attack to take place. So I think it's very important for Americans to be conscious of the need for security. And each one of us has to be patient as we go through checkout lines and check-in lines, and we also have to be willing to use plastic knives instead of knives that have metal in them, and we need to give up our fingernail clippers. Well, I don't object to things like that, even though we might go to extremes at first, and sometimes we'll come back later so we can take fingernail clippers on the airplanes. But still, in the aftermath of that attack, I think it was very good, both practically and psychologically, for Americans to know we are really doing something to prevent a recurrence of this terrible attack. But in the long term, the protection of American civil liberties and the freedom of our people will be the foundation for the strength of our country. And it won't be based on the arrest of citizens who came here from Arab countries, or maybe students who have overstayed their visa, or people that were even captured in Afghanistan and are held on Guantanamo. That's a temporary thing. And our country will pass it, and we will go back to being citizens of the greatest and the most free and prosperous and safe, and I hope the most benevolent nation in the world. I have confidence that that's what our country will be. Thank you all.